A dense thicket of ideas opens up when we attempt to situate ourselves in the historical horizon of the being born into um, an umvelt of ideas. So Philip K. Dick, as the superimposed over Dostoevsky, superimposed over Socratic anamnesis, his idea of orthogonal time. So it seems that this idea of orthogonal time, which would apparently, I don't particularly like the films. When I saw the first Matrix film, I was impressed by the special effects, which were bleeding edge at the time. But other than that, I don't particularly like them. I think they're more attractive to people that are very unbalanced towards being extroverted, and they want everything to be. And as Philip K. Dick was, in my opinion, they want things to be shown in external images rather than to um, have them closer, so close that they can't see them. So the notion of the matrix is already in Philip K. Dick because he's inherited historically the notion of matrix equations in Schrodinger and in the last actual physicist. Although there's a few physicists in recent years that seem to be um, fairly thoughtful, but where the market is glutted with just total imbeciles who are do nothing but they're not total imbeciles in the sense they're imbeciles in the sense that they're not physicists, they're teachers of physics, which is totally different. It's just as like somebody can teach art without being in any sense a genuine artist, because there's some techniques and they can be learned with as long as there's diligence. Diligence is not nothing, but there's most people can be diligent if they're motivated in some way. But the real physicist, just as a real artist, is something very rare. And if we have high standards, then we have to say most physicists are just professors. They're not actual physicists. Most people in any field are just repeating certain techniques that can be reliably transmitted to a new generation. But they're not people that are primarily capable of original discoveries in the field. They can't proceed in the field to pose themselves questions in a serious way, in the way that if you just listen for a few minutes to Oppenheimer talk, you can see that is not anything like the people that present physics to us in the present period. So they have in Philip K. Dick this notion of Brahman as a position where sort of computer matrix understanding of time can be opened up, and he claims, apparently straightforwardly, to have written many of his novels, has anamnesis, as a kind of semi-Socratic anamnesis, not going to the core of the ideas, but rather going to other presents with the heightened awareness that there can never be anything but the present. Just as we experience waking up and doing our daily routines in the present, even though we say it's a different day, it's the same present. So in this way, the orthogonal time idea is that there's a different presence, so that it's not just that we encounter the Umwelt uh, always in the same shelling our presentation, as it were, but also that there was a world where the Nazis won the war, the man in the high castle, that there were other scenarios that they could be remembered, that there could be some that in fact even at the level of the Brahman or matrix consciousness, as Philip K. Dick understood, that perhaps there could be insight into this, and then one could oneself become Brahmin or become at this center, which isn't the center, this non-spatial, non-temporal center out where the Christians locate God the Father. We have here a series of stimulating ideas, but there's a thicket that makes it difficult initially to connect them up to our thoughts. But that's why I want to emphasize one thing about these ideas is that there's an element where they're very historically dependent. Now let's contrast this kind of case with Heidegger, and see if Heidegger achieves a greater depth or allows us an avenue of invasion which is helpful. So Heidegger would say, let's look at the idea of Dasein and the idea of Ereignisse through the lens of the notion of being born into a world. So we wake up. So Carl Jung said at a certain age, maybe when he's around early teens or so, he just sort of, as though stepped out of fog and realized that he was there in himself, and he remembers it keenly. One steps into a world and its ideas, and for instance, I'll give an anecdote for myself. I remember when I was very young reading Melville, reading Moby Dick, and almost always books of that kind, I usually read only the ones that I like and that I'm intrigued with. But for some reason, that book, probably because Melville is just read Shakespeare before he wrote it, and he was using so many his verbal art was run wild. I thought to myself, this book is kind of tedious, but how is it that I got then this notion that I ought to read it? Nobody had told me that I ought to read it, but I had some vague sense, this is an important book, and one is somehow obliged to read this kind of book, and so I should suffer through and read it. Where did that come from? So somehow I was born into a world where the book, some books, we had, even without anyone directly telling us we're supposed to read them, it was somehow we knew that they were something that was considered important. Why? I don't know. If we had lived in another time, certainly we wouldn't have had this feeling of obligation towards the same things, right? So that's historical accrual, and one dimension of it. Let's look. So there's an article by Susan Edmonds proving in a forensic way, so to speak, making a strong case for, and it's generally accepted, for something that was partially known, which is that this idea of the, how is it called? Nepios, Homeric Nepios, it's just not necessarily Homeric, but it appears in Iliad and Odyssey, but in generally ancient Greek notion of Nepios, which was already at an early date identified by Cicero and by others. Cicero, who's at the school of Athens a couple hundred years after Plato and Socrates and Aristotle were gone, had identified this word with infants, or enfant, and I think we get it through the French and American enfant, and in Latin he identified it directly with nepios as a two-part word, where the first part is negation or no, and the second part is means something like speech, on, not, font, speech, something like that. But it turns out when people really read this, and then this etymology came down to us and many scholars took it as straightforwardly the truth. They grew into a world where this was considered to be the truth, but then it was found through extensive look at the usage in text that it didn't really fit. So, for instance, um, there's a place where two uh, uh, baby birds have had their parents devoured by predators, and they're said to be nepios, which then some people thought meant not infant, but rather ineptus, Latin word ineptus. They hadn't yet been taught how to handle themselves, they're inept. So then we get this notion of maybe this word nepios could mean simply inept rather than infant, or rather than the literal meaning, rather than non-speaking, and there's hundreds of examples of different that can lead us in different ways from the literature, right? Hundreds of usages, and then we have to derive what we think it means. But eventually, it was demonstrated what was kind of known by close readers of these texts, but hadn't been really proved before this Susan Edmonds paper, that what this word means is being cut off from the ancestors. So, in other words, this bird's parents were dead, and they weren't able to grow into the world of those birds, which in human terms would be the emotional and moral and the intellectual deposit of the culture. They were cut off from that. So then, of course, here we have all these problems, like Avital, we're now dealing with the idiot and the notion of the idiot child or the wild child. And what would anthropology problems? What would happen if you raised a child with that would be nepios in this sense without the accrual? But the start point of Heidegger is the notion that we all, as it were, just wake up out of the fog, and that's properly the first step if we're phenomenologically honest with ourselves, rather than if we accept, as Durkheim says, everything that the society we grow into is telling us we're obliged to believe, otherwise we will be regarded as non-human and the society will treat us accordingly and destroy us. So there's extreme eugenics, in a certain way, logical eugenics. Beginning from this point of the Aragnus, do we get something more basic than we get when we go into, let's put it this way: does it help us to have this as superimposed over what we get from the Hindu text, what we get from Philip K. Dick, who's no doubt giving phenomenological testimony of his experience? Do we get something more out of also bringing these notions together? Dostoevsky notes of the ridiculous man, his vision of the world of human personality as it is in the other world, not contaminated by the historical accrual. Philip K. Dick with the orthogonal time, notion of Brahman as this cosmic being awakening out of the lotus blossom. Heidegger with the Aragnus and the Seinfrage, with certain special starting points, which I can't, but I feel I can't in a technical way lay out the all the questions which seem to give better than merely ontic access. But one is the sense of Dasein as the unique singular, which is then juxtaposed over all kinds of repeated ideas. I end with just a historical remark. The Greek thinking that we've received begins primarily with the question of dividing essence from accident, that somebody is essentially let's say Philip K. Dick. Then Philip K. Dick gets a haircut. Is his accidental change, but he's still Philip K. Dick. But then so this is the essence of the major distinction among the Greeks, and then in the Germans we get the distinction between the transcendental and the predicatory. There's already a lot about predication in the ancients, the predicatory logic, but in the Germans it becomes totalized. Hegel is the last one to do this. Hegel's no longer credible in our time and falls away, but we still have the accrual. And then we get still the claim, so in Meritu, for instance, we get the claim that this transcendental or ontological position, what's the possibility of any experience, is set off against the predication. What can be said out of the logos, write down the time. That's how you know, that's how you stand still and are able to say something repeatedly against the flux of changes which would happen in the world of that possible experience. That's what gives it its Wissenschaft or scientific character. And then out of this we get the phenomenology, and then we get finally to this Ereignis. And it seems to me, if we state more of the details, more of the, in a sort of sense of metaphysical details, we can see through constantly gaining in familiarity with this territory, with the ideas involved, then we get a sense of the possibility of helping ourselves through gaining a better access. And in the traditional version, what that means is, the trees and other things are not posing these questions, but we are, and they could give us guidance in some way.